Hey guys, tonight we drift gently into one of the most peculiar and oddly soothing tales to emerge from the annals of medieval law. Picture a sleepy French village blanketed in fog. The morning bells haven't rung yet, but already a small crowd has gathered near the courthouse, a crumbling stone building that leans just slightly to one side, like it's tired of standing. You stand among them, a little out of place in your soft cloak and boots caked with yesterday's road dust. The air smells faintly of firewood and hay, and in the center of the square is a goose. White, fluffy, blinkingly serene. Tied to a post, it hunks softly, like it knows what's coming. Because today, the goose is on trial. Yes, an actual trial, a formal, robe-wearing, evidence-presenting legal proceeding. And the defendant, waddling slightly as it's led to the dock, is this very goose. You probably won't survive 5 minutes in this world, not because of the goose, but because everything here takes hours, days even. Justice moves slowly when quills are involved. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Pop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle a little closer to the scene. It's not every day you witness a goose about to be held accountable under the law. A robed clerk scratches notes into a vellum ledger. The judge is already seated, an elderly man with sleep in the corners of his eyes and a powdered wig that keeps slipping sideways. There's a mild rustle from the townspeople as the bailiff calls the courtroom to order. One woman loudly adjusts her bonnet. A child points and giggles until shushed. Even the town drunk, snoozing in a nearby wheelbarrow, seems to stir slightly. The judge taps a wooden rod. "Proceedings shall now commence," he says in a tone better suited for a dramatic cathedral sermon. You blink slowly. Did he just say that? Yes. Welcome to 15th century France, where animals could, and often did, stand trial for their misdeeds. And it wasn't even the weirdest part of the day. The clerk clears his throat and reads the charge. Assault upon a minor, aggravated by pecking and aggressive wing activity. The goose lets out a loud, suspiciously well-timed honk. A few villagers snicker. Someone whispers, "He did that on purpose." You try to keep a straight face. Historians still argue whether this particular goose incident was fabricated for local entertainment or truly followed the strict protocols of animal prosecution, which, yes, was a real thing. But the court documents, some faded, some lovingly recopied, suggest this trial did in fact happen, and not as a joke. You glance at the accused again. The goose seems comfortable. If anything, it's the only creature in the room not tense. Its feathers are fluffed just right. It yawns. The courtroom, such as it is, features crooked wooden pews and a series of waxy candles that drip dramatically, despite the fact that it's mid-morning. Some townsfolk munch quietly on dried apples. You smell onions. Always onions. And then there's the plaintiff, a nervous man with ink-stained hands, and a son whose nose is bandaged. The child looks more interested in poking at a beetle crawling across the floor than in seeking justice. Would the accused like to respond? The judge asks, peering down his nose. Silence. Of course, it's a goose. The judge sighs. Very well, we proceed without direct testimony. In the back row, a woman mutters, "I knew that goose was trouble the moment it waddled into our garden." Her neighbor hums in agreement. The clerk tries to maintain order with a hasty shh, which only makes things louder. By now, the air inside the courtroom has warmed slightly. Dust dances lazily through the shafts of light, making it all feel more dream than drama. You lean back, not wanting to miss a moment of this sleepy chaos. There's something comforting, oddly enough, in the sheer slowness of it all. No one is in a hurry. Not even the goose. Mainstream historical fact, animal trials weren't just bizarre one-offs. From roughly the 13th to the 18th centuries, Europe held countless such proceedings. Pigs, dogs, rats, even insects were summoned to court and punished under the same laws as humans. They were tried for crimes ranging from theft to murder, usually with a straight face and pages of solemn documentation. And this sleepy village is no exception. Quirky tidbit? Well, in one famous Swiss case, a group of beetles was once excommunicated from church lands for damaging crops. Yes, beetles, banished by a bishop. Back in the room, someone coughs. The judge nods solemnly, signaling the clerk to call the first witness. A hunched man with a thick accent takes the stand to describe the goose's strange eyes and menacing wobble. The crowd listens as if the fate of the kingdom depends on it. It does not. The goose preens, looking unusually smug. The village cat sneaks in, stretches dramatically, then curls up beneath the bench of a well-meaning peasant woman who's already asleep. And just like that, the scene drifts onward. You shift slightly on the hard wooden bench, careful not to creak too loudly. The witness has finished testifying, ending his tale with an impassioned warning about demonic behavior and the goose's unnatural stillness. His voice quivers with a theatrical dread, like he's describing something out of a fairy tale. You'd think the goose had been caught conjuring spirits or plotting with ravens, not pecking at a child with jam-covered fingers. The judge thanks him and scribbles something illegible on a parchment, probably just a doodle of a goose in stocks. The witness bows, badly, and nearly trips over the hem of his own coat on the way back to his seat. The goose blinks. Now it's time for the defense. And yes, because this is a real legal proceeding, there is a lawyer for the goose. You stifle a yawn as the advocate stands, brushing down his faded robes with all the pomp of someone representing actual nobility. His hair is wild and his beard even wilder, but his voice has that unmistakable courtroom gravity that makes you feel like something deeply important is happening, even if it very much isn't. My client, he begins, gesturing dramatically toward the goose, is but a humble creature, a domestic fowl, a gatherer of grain, a bringer of breakfast. He pauses. To suggest malice, intentional harm from such an innocent being is to misunderstand nature itself. Somewhere, a pigeon coos in agreement. Historians still argue, he adds slyly, whether animals in these trials were truly believed to hold moral responsibility, or if they were simply used to reinforce social order, a performance, if you will. That earns a few nods, mostly from people who just like hearing words like social order. He continues, weaving together a poetic defense involving the goose's instincts, its inability to reason, and, rather boldly, a comparison to St. Francis, who famously preached to birds. That last one feels like a stretch, but no one objects, probably because they're busy wondering what's for lunch. You glance around the courtroom. A pair of monks whisper quietly in the corner, sharing a hunk of coarse bread. One of them sneezes into his sleeve. No one blesses him. In the rafters above, 2 swallows flutter in and out, unnoticed. The natural world doesn't seem particularly bothered by this whole charade. The judge strokes his chin, clearly taking the defense into serious consideration. Or maybe he's trying to remember whether he fed his own geese this morning. Either way, he nods gravely and calls a recess. The crowd begins to stir. Benches creak, cloaks rustle. Someone lets out a surprisingly musical yawn. Outside, the village clock tower tolls noon, and you follow the slow, sleepy exodus into the square. The sunlight is gentle now, filtered through a gauzy sky. You wander past a cart selling roasted chestnuts, their warm, nutty scent blending with chimney smoke. A group of children run by, giggling, one of them honking like the defendant. He gets a round of applause. You find yourself standing next to the defense lawyer, who now seems far less majestic in the light of day. He offers you a wink. Ever defended a goose? He asks. You shake your head. Good, it's exhausting. He mutters something about payment in eggs and waddles off, his robes catching on a barrel. You're left alone for a moment, the village swirling gently around you. There's something about this place, this slow, slightly absurd rhythm that feels safe, like a dream you forgot you were having. Back inside the courtroom, the afternoon session begins with something unexpected, a sermon. A priest has been called to weigh in, not on the legalities, but on the moral implications of goose behavior. He begins with the book of Genesis, of course. Then he quotes St. Augustine. Then he veers into something about the symbolic nature of white feathers. Purity of soul, he says, but also the capacity for temptation. You're not sure whether he means the goose or humans in general. The priest himself seems confused midway through, but carries on with the confidence of someone who knows no one is actually listening. You notice two jurors gently dozing, their heads nodding in sync like sleepy metronomes. The goose honks once, loud, echoing. Everyone stirs. It's almost like it planned that. Mainstream historical fact. During the Middle Ages, clergy were often asked to participate in trials, not just human ones, but also these animal affairs. Their input was considered vital to determine whether a creature had been influenced by demonic forces or natural instincts. In fact, the church sometimes played both judge and executioner in such cases. Animals were burned, hanged, even excommunicated, all under the watchful eye of Scripture. Quirky tidbit, there are records of a rooster once being burned alive in Basel for allegedly laying an egg. Why was that bad? Because medieval lore claimed that a cock's egg could hatch into a basilisk, a deadly serpent-like monster. Whether that egg was ever real or just a particularly unfortunate rock is anyone's guess. Back in our courtroom, the priest finally finishes, declaring that the goose is in need of grace, but not beyond redemption. The judge furrows his brow. He's scribbling again, maybe a poem this time. Then, just when you think things can't get more surreal, a second goose is let in. Not another suspect. This one's a character witness. Yes, you heard that right. A witness for the goose. Apparently, this new goose shared the same coop as the accused. The bailiff presents it with a sort of reverence, as though unveiling the crown jewels. The courtroom leans forward, and the witness does nothing. It stands there, blinks, preens, then poops. The prosecution looks smug, the defense undeterred. Clearly uncooperative, he says, but not incriminating. The judge sighs. You rest your head against the cool stone wall. Your eyes begin to droop, not from boredom, but from the gentle lull of the absurdity around you. This sleepy courtroom, with its rickety furniture and oversized sense of justice, is oddly soothing. Nothing moves quickly. Nothing matters too much. And even when it does, it's still just about a goose. The air inside the courtroom has thickened into a kind of shared haze. You stretch your legs, shift your weight. The new goose, the so-called character witness, is led back out with a few reluctant flaps. It leaves behind a small mess and a large question mark. No one quite knows what to do next. A hush settles, like the whole room has collectively forgotten why it's here. Then, from the rear of the room, a woman stands. She's small and stern, wrapped tightly in a plum-colored shawl that's clearly seen better days. Her face looks like it spent most of its time squinting into the wind, and she has the distinct energy of someone who once chased a thief barefoot and won. I have something to say, she announces. The judge sighs, but nods. He's given up pretending that this trial is about law. It's now a kind of village theater, and she, apparently, is ready for her debut. I'm the neighbor, she begins, of the farmer who owns that goose. Have been for 15 years. And I'll tell you what, that bird is no devil. But it is, and I say this plainly, an absolute menace. The crowd shifts. Eyebrows lift. Someone drops an apple. She plunges forward. It waits outside my door every morning like it's timing me. Soon as I step out, it honks loud and charges, pecks at my ankles like I insulted its mother. A few people chuckle. I've seen it block carts, bite at hymns, even chase a horse straight into a ditch. That's not a bird, that's a feathery outlaw. There it is again. Modern asides aside, a goose being described as a criminal feels both ridiculous and oddly appropriate. Still, historians continue to debate whether these trials reflected sincere belief or were more about ritualized control. Was it about maintaining the illusion of justice, or did they truly think this bird had a conscience? The line was blurrier back then, especially when that line was drawn in straw and superstition. The judge asks if she was ever physically harmed. She smirks. I've got scars on my calves that'll tell you stories this court won't believe. The scribe in the corner coughs, clearly suppressing a laugh, and resumes writing, probably embellishing her speech into poetry. You glance back toward the goose. It looks bored, deeply, soulfully bored, as if it's been through this a dozen times before, as if it knows that human justice is too slow, too loud, and way too obsessed with itself. The woman sits down. Another witness takes her place. This one's a teenage boy, red-cheeked and twitchy. He says he used to feed the goose leftover porridge every morning, until one day the goose decided it liked buttons more. I mean, it ate 3 of them, he says, right off my coat, like they were raisins. Then it looked me in the eye, like it dared me to complain. A few people chuckle. I've seen it block carts, bite at hymns, even chase a horse straight into a ditch. That's not a bird, that's a feathery outlaw. There it is again. Modern asides aside, a goose being described as a criminal feels both ridiculous and oddly appropriate. Still, historians continue to debate whether these trials reflected sincere belief or were more about ritualized control. Was it about maintaining the illusion of justice, or did they truly think this bird had a conscience? The line was blurrier back then, especially when that line was drawn in straw in superstition. The judge asks if she was ever physically harmed. She smirks. I've got scars on my calves that'll tell you stories this court won't believe. The scribe in the corner coughs, clearly suppressing a laugh, and resumes writing, probably embellishing her speech into poetry. You glance back toward the goose. It looks bored, deeply, soulfully bored, as if it's been through this a dozen times before, as if it knows that human justice is too slow, too loud, and way too obsessed with itself. The woman sits down. Another witness takes her place. This one's a teenage boy, red-cheeked and twitchy. He says he used to feed the goose leftover porridge every morning, until one day the goose decided it liked buttons more. I mean, it ate 3 of them, he says, right off my coat, like they were raisins. Then it looked me in the eye, like it dared me to complain. A few people chuckle. I've seen it block carts, bite at hymns, even chase a horse straight into a ditch. That's not a bird, that's a feathery outlaw. There it is again. Modern asides aside, a goose being described as a criminal feels both ridiculous and oddly appropriate. Still, historians continue to debate whether these trials reflected sincere belief or were more about ritualized control. Was it about maintaining the illusion of justice, or did they truly think this bird had a conscience? The line was blurrier back then, especially when that line was drawn in straw and superstition. The judge asks if she was ever physically harmed. She smirks. I've got scars on my calves that'll tell you stories this court won't believe. The scribe in the corner coughs, clearly suppressing a laugh, and resumes writing, probably embellishing her speech into poetry. You glance back toward the goose. It looks bored, deeply, soulfully bored, as if it's been through this a dozen times before, as if it knows that human justice is too slow, too loud, and way too obsessed with itself. The woman sits down. Another witness takes her place. This one's a teenage boy, red-cheeked and twitchy. He says he used to feed the goose leftover porridge every morning, until one day the goose decided it liked buttons more. I mean, it ate 3 of them, he says, right off my coat, like they were raisins. Then it looked me in the eye like it dared me to complain. Mainstream fact break. By the late Middle Ages, animals had been put on trial for a variety of offenses: pigs, cows, horses, dogs, and yes, geese. Charges included theft, destruction of property, assault, and, in some tragicomic cases, murder. These trials followed proper legal procedure too, complete with lawyers, witnesses, and sometimes even appeals. Quirky tidbit. In 1457, a sow in France was convicted of murdering a child and was sentenced to death by hanging. Her piglets were also tried as accessories, but were acquitted due to lack of evidence. That's right, piglets were given a fairer trial than many people in history. Back in the courtroom, things are getting theatrical. The prosecution has brought in props. A miniature diorama, a tiny recreation of the alleged crime scene. There's a straw model of the courtyard, a little painted fence, even a thumb-sized child figurine with a fake jam stain on its tunic. The whole thing looks like a misguided school project, but the crowd gasps appreciatively. This, the prosecutor says, is a rendering of the moment when our young villager was attacked. You can clearly see the proximity of the goose to the child and the absence of any provocation. You lean forward. The goose is represented by a rough lump of gray wool stuck on a toothpick. Someone whispers that it looks more like a hedgehog than a bird. Still, the drama of it carries weight. The judge furrows his brow deeply. The woolen goose wobbles precariously. The defense stands, clears his throat, and walks over to the table. Without breaking eye contact, he flicks the woolen goose off the diorama. It sails through the air and lands on the floor with a soft puff. He turns to the judge. I rest my case. Laughter erupts, brief and sleepy. A few claps. One person shouts "encore" before being gently hushed by a monk. The judge bangs his gavel. Well, a carved stick he occasionally smacks against his knee. Order is restored. Barely. Outside, the sky is shifting, pale blue fading into ash and gold. A dog barks lazily in the distance. Somewhere, a baker dumps the last of his flour into a wooden trough. You close your eyes for a moment. The rhythm of this place, the strange courtroom rituals, the flow of exaggerated accusations and folksy defenses, it all begins to feel oddly like a bedtime story. One that's been passed down and twisted over generations until no one really remembers what the point was, just that it was told and retold and still makes you smile. The court announces another brief recess. People shuffle outside to stretch, to gossip, to snack. You wander over to the goose's holding pen, where it now sits, calmly grooming its feathers. You meet its gaze. There's nothing guilty in those eyes. Just the deep, bottomless indifference of a creature that knows the world will turn, whether it's convicted or not. You lean closer. "Did you do it?" you whisper. The goose stares at you, then honks, loudly. A splash of water from its trough hits your boot. You take that as a yes or a no, or maybe just a reminder that some things defy interpretation, like dreams or dioramas, or trials with birds. When court resumes, there's a noticeable shift in mood. The sun outside dips a little lower, and everything inside the chamber seems cast in amber, muted, still, like time has decided to yawn and stretch. You blink slowly. Your seat creaks beneath you as a fresh round of participants enters the space. The judge looks tired now, not just physically, existentially. You get the sense he woke up this morning expecting to arbitrate a land dispute or maybe scold a merchant over unfair grain prices. Not, adjudicate the soul of a waterfowl. A clerk stands, unrolls a scroll with a dramatic "whoop," and announces the next expert witness. Enter Father Ambrose. He's a lean, pale man with fingers like dried twigs and a hairline that retreated around the same time the plague did. He glides forward with an air of cautious reverence, like every step must first be approved by St. Augustine. You hear someone whisper, "Oh, good, the theologian." It doesn't sound like a compliment. Father Ambrose clears his throat, a long, wheezy process that seems to go on just a beat too long, and begins. "Ladies and gentlemen, and Goose." Pause. A few titters. "I am here to address a pressing spiritual concern. If an animal sins, can it be saved? More importantly, can it know it has sinned?" You sigh. You did not bring enough bread for this. Still, it's a fascinating debate, one that actually dominated certain corners of medieval scholarship. You'd think people back then had bigger worries, what with war and famine and surprise leprosy. But no, sometimes their biggest intellectual battles were about whether a pig had free will. Father Ambrose continues, "If this goose," he gestures vaguely like the bird might rise up and rebuke him, "did indeed commit violence upon a child, we must ask, was it driven by base instinct or something darker?" He turns slowly toward the jury. Was it possessed? Ah, there it is, the demon bird angle. Classic. Mainstream fact, in medieval Europe, especially in rural France, people genuinely believed that demons could possess animals. Not just dogs and cats, but frogs, goats, even bees. There are records of exorcisms performed on cows. Cows! You can't make this stuff up, though they definitely did. Father Ambrose holds up a small bottle of holy water, just in case. He sprinkles it toward the goose. The goose yawns. A scholar in the back, robes wrinkled, glasses slipping, chimes in. "Pardon me, Father, but wouldn't demonic possession imply guilt lies with the demon, not the vessel?" A murmur of agreement ripples through the benches. This is the medieval version of a Reddit thread, and it's getting heated. Perhaps, Ambrose concedes, but vessels can be chosen for a reason. Weakness invites corruption. He's clearly warming to the sermon. If this goose is indeed guilty, it may not be of its own making, but of the farmer's negligence or the village's moral decay. Big words for a guy arguing against poultry. You notice the prosecutor scribbling a note, probably trying to spin this into "the goose is a mirror of us all." Meanwhile, the defense looks like he's about to take a nap. But then the scribe interrupts. He has an announcement. Apparently, a traveler from the next village over has just arrived. Claims he saw the goose after the attack, strutting proudly through town with what he described as a stolen bonnet. The courtroom perks up. A stolen bonnet? Now we're talking scandal. The traveler steps up. He's got dust on his boots, mud on his hem, and the kind of mustache that looks like it grew out of pure gossip. He swears he saw the goose pecking at a pie left on a windowsill, then tugging a child's bonnet off a laundry line and making a grand exit, wings flapping like it had just robbed a stagecoach. Quirky tidbit. There's actually a documented 14th century case in which a rooster was accused of laying an egg and believed to be an agent of Satan. The town panicked, the egg was destroyed, and the rooster was executed. Compared to that, a bonnet-thieving goose is practically a folk hero. The judge nods. Theft, then, in addition to assault. You glance around the courtroom. People are leaning in. This has stopped being a trial. It's now folklore happening live. The defense finally stirs. "I would like to call for an environmental evaluation." Everyone blinks. He continues. "Has anyone considered that perhaps this goose's behavior is a result of unnatural living conditions? Crowding, poor feed, perhaps the presence of toxins?" You hear someone mutter, "Here we go, blame the diet." But it's not a bad angle. Historians still argue whether these animal trials were symbolic, didactic, or simply superstitious pantomimes meant to reflect deeper communal anxieties. The Goose trial might have been less about punishing a bird and more about restoring a sense of cosmic order after a tragedy. The judge agrees to send someone to inspect the goose's pen and general living area. A peasant is dispatched. The trial breaks again. You wander toward the window, stretch your back, and breathe in the late-day air. Someone's burning wood nearby. Oak, maybe. You hear the faint ring of a blacksmith's hammer. This is all becoming so absurd, it's almost poetic. A goose on trial, a ghost bonnet, a holy water sprinkle. And yet somehow it all fits. It makes sense in that strange, timeless space between dreaming and waking. Like the village needs this performance, this ritual, to feel like things are still in balance. You find yourself feeling oddly protective of the goose. Maybe it is a menace, but also, it's a goose. It honks and flaps and poops indiscriminately. That's not evil. That's just goose. Still, the trial resumes. Another scroll is unrolled. Another accusation begins. You settle back into your seat, wondering what on earth they'll charge it with next. Probably heresy. The room's getting stuffy now. The kind of warm that makes your eyelids hang a little heavier and your thoughts slow into a thick syrup. But you're still there, still watching, still somehow invested in the fate of one extremely unlucky goose. Court is back in session, and now the local apothecary is taking the stand. He's a wiry man, built like someone who has spent too many years measuring dried herbs and not enough drinking water. His fingers are stained green, mint, nettle, something vaguely ominous, and his expression suggests he didn't expect to be here today, or any day really. Your Honor, he begins, squinting at the judge as if sunlight is streaming from the man's forehead, I've been asked to evaluate the mental state of the accused. Yes, that's right. The goose is now receiving a medieval psychiatric review. Because apparently someone, probably the defense, suggested that the bird may be afflicted with melancholic imbalance. This was, believe it or not, a real diagnosis in medieval times. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was the prevailing explanation for everything from fevers to fits of rage to, yes, goose-related misbehavior. So the apothecary continues. I have observed the bird. Its droppings are unusually runny, its honking irregular. These are clear signs of internal distress, possibly an excess of black bile. I recommend leeching. You blink. Did he just suggest putting leeches on a goose? The judge blinks too. Leeches? Yes, the apothecary says firmly, applied carefully behind the wings, or possibly around the webbing of the feet to draw out the imbalance. You're not sure whether to laugh or cry, but a few scribes dutifully write it down. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval medicine often involved balancing the four humors, and treatments included leeches, purging, and bloodletting, even for animals. Sick horses, dogs, even pigs received these treatments, often with disastrous results. Then, suddenly, a rustle at the back of the room. A new figure enters, an elderly woman, bent with age, draped in layers of wool and linen. Her presence hushes the room like someone just walked across a sacred grave. The wise woman, someone whispers, of the river marsh. Now things are about to get interesting. She is not officially recognized by the church, the state, or anyone who writes in ink, but everyone here respects her, maybe even fears her a little. She raises ducks, whispers charms over sick children, and knows exactly when the frogs will start singing each spring. She steps forward without waiting to be called. Her cane taps softly on the wooden floor. I have known this goose, she says, voice like dry leaves. Some snorts from the prosecution's bench, but no one interrupts. The child it attacked may not have been innocent. The silence thickens. You feel a shift, like the room has suddenly tilted sideways. The wise woman continues, slow and measured. Animals sense what we do not. The boy was cruel. He'd throw stones at the smaller birds, pull legs off frogs, tie strings to beetles and set them on fire. It's a lot to digest. The judge leans forward. Do you have proof of this? The old woman shrugs. I have seen it. So have others. But they won't speak. They fear his father. This is no longer just a trial about a goose. It's become a mirror of the village itself. People shift uncomfortably. You get the feeling some long-buried grievances are about to claw their way up through the floorboards. Historians still argue whether these trials were strictly literal or deeply symbolic, ritual theater for working through communal guilt, loss, or unrest. In this case, the goose may have become a scapegoat in the oldest sense. The judge calls a recess to consider this development. You step outside again. The air is cooler now, touched with evening. Chickens coo nearby. Someone's roasting garlic. Somewhere down the lane, a lute plays softly, just a few drifting, clumsy notes. Back inside, you overhear the jurors debating the difference between animal instinct and divine punishment. One of them thinks the goose is an omen. Another swears it winked at her when she passed a pen. You're not sure what's real anymore. Maybe none of this is. Maybe it doesn't matter. The trial resumes. The judge is visibly troubled. We must determine, he says, whether this goose acted out of evil, illness, or justice. That word hangs thick in the air. Justice. No one expected to land here, not with feathers and bonnets and priestly mutterings, but here you are. You glance at the goose. It blinks slowly, as if waiting for the world to catch up to whatever it already knows. A final witness is called, the blacksmith's daughter. She's no more than 10, wide-eyed and wearing boots far too big for her. I saw the goose, she says, voice clear, and the boy. You lean in. He was pulling its feathers. It honked and bit him. He yelled and kicked it. Pause. Then he tried to throw a rock, but he slipped, hit his head. A murmur ripples across the courtroom. So the goose didn't attack, it reacted. The judge nods slowly, as if something heavy inside him just unlocked. He thanks the girl and dismisses her gently. You exhale, long and slow. This might change everything. The final arguments begin, but your mind drifts as the fire crackles and the shadows lengthen. You've been here all day, swept up in something ridiculous, profound, and strangely moving. And it's not over yet. You blink slowly, letting your breath deepen as the shadows stretch across the wooden floor. There's something about the hush of twilight that makes even absurdity feel sacred. The trial is winding toward a verdict now, though the pace is glacial, part ritual, part sleepy stalling. The judge, who you now realize hasn't had a sip of water in what must be 6 hours, clears his throat again. We must retire, he says, addressing the 12 villagers chosen to judge the goose. We have heard witnesses, we have considered omens, we have endured the apothecary's leech proposal. There's a tired chuckle from the benches. And so the jury leaves the chamber to deliberate. This is when the town's priest steps up, candlelight dancing across the silver threads in his robe. May I offer guidance while we wait, he asks. No one says no. He opens a battered book, thick parchment, tooled leather, worn soft at the spine. You're expecting scripture. Instead, he reads a passage about Saint Gwynfort, the greyhound who was venerated as a protector of infants. That's right, a dog. A literal hound became a saint in local folk religion, despite the church's eventual outrage. Mainstream fact? In 13th century France, people in the Domes region treated Gwynfort like a martyr. He had saved a child, been wrongfully killed, and was then honored at a shrine. The church later condemned this practice, but the people didn't care. They kept lighting candles for their canine saint. You glance again at the goose. Now things are really blurring. Justice, faith, instinct, superstition, it's all bleeding together like wet ink on rough vellum. The priest closes the book. Animals may be innocent, but they are not free from consequence, he says gently, just as we are not free from misjudgment. That one lands hard. The villagers shift again. The blacksmith picks at a callus. Someone coughs in the corner. The baker's wife wipes her eyes with the hem of her sleeve. The air is heavy with something unspoken, like they all know this goose is not just a goose. It's carrying the weight of something older, deeper, maybe even something collective. Historians still argue whether these animal trials were sincere or symbolic. Some say they were just an extension of legal formalism, a way to show that order touched every corner of creation. Others insist these trials were social rituals, ways for a community to process grief or shame or powerlessness. The jury returns. You feel a little queasy. The foreman, an elderly man with arms like root vegetables and a brow creased by years of sun, stands and speaks. We find the goose not guilty of murder. A pause. But guilty of unruly conduct and public disruption. Your jaw doesn't drop, but it wobbles slightly. The judge nods. Then we shall issue a sentence of banishment. Yes, the goose is exiled. You didn't think geese had passports, but apparently this one is now persona non grata in this particular French hamlet. Let it be released, the judge says, to the wilds beyond the abbey stream. May it find peace there. The priest murmurs a small prayer. The clerk records the ruling. A few gasps and giggles ripple through the crowd. And then, just like that, the trial is over. You expect applause or relief, but mostly the villagers just begin to stand, brushing crumbs from their laps, murmuring softly to each other, the way people do after a funeral or a wedding or a very strange dream. You rise too, your knees a little stiff. Out in the courtyard, the sun is gone. Only deep blue sky now, streaked with the last pinks of the dying day. Someone lights a torch. Someone else stretches like a cat. And the goose? Still in its little pen, looking vaguely triumphant, or maybe just hungry. Two young boys arrive, carrying it in a makeshift sling. They begin the slow walk toward the abbey stream, like they're escorting royalty into exile. You follow at a distance. The town is so quiet now, just the crunch of boots on gravel, the low drone of evening bugs, a soft breeze curling through the wheat. And then, by the stream, they lower the goose gently onto the grass. It flaps its wings once, shakes itself, honks a little indignantly, and waddles off into the reeds like nothing particularly unusual happened today. Maybe for the goose, it didn't. You stay there a moment longer, letting the sky darken fully above you. The stars are already blinking awake, quiet little sentinels of the absurd and the miraculous. You remember how this whole thing started. A child, a bird, a moment of pain or misunderstanding. And you realize now that the verdict, the trial, even the leeches, they weren't the point. The village needed this. Not to punish the goose, but to process its own shadows. Sometimes, when humans can't fix a thing directly, they create a ritual around it. They name it, weigh it, put it on trial, even if it wears feathers and honks. You smile softly. Your feet are sore. You've witnessed justice, sort of, and somewhere in the marshy dark, a goose is falling asleep under the stars. You walk back slowly through the sleepy village, the breeze curling around your ankles like a shy cat. The stars blink above you, soft and unbothered, as if they've watched this kind of foolishness for centuries. Maybe they have. But here's the thing. That wasn't the only trial of its kind. Not even close. Turns out, medieval France had a thing for prosecuting animals, like a real thing. You pass the village square, now quiet except for the wooden creak of a hanging sign and the rhythmic chirp of frogs. As you go, snippets of gossip drift from nearby windows. Someone says they once saw a pig excommunicated for stealing a pie. Someone else insists they remember a donkey being accused of heresy. And yes, those are real stories. Mainstream fact, in 1386, in the town of Falaise, France, a sow was put on trial for attacking a child. The trial was formal. The pig had a lawyer. It wore human clothes in court, and when it was found guilty, it was executed publicly by hanging. That's not a legend. That's an actual record from the French legal system. The idea, strange as it sounds, was based on the belief that animals, especially domesticated ones, were part of the moral order. They lived among humans, obeyed commands, shared spaces. So when they broke the law, justice was expected. But still, a pig in a hat? You imagine the courtroom now, someone straightening a tiny collar on a pig's neck, a judge flipping through parchments, pretending this is all perfectly normal. A scribe trying not to laugh as he jots down, defendant oinked in protest. And that's where your feet take you next, the old village archives. You duck under the crooked lintel of a stone building, smell dust and candle wax, and settle in by a sputtering oil lamp. Scrolls are stacked like driftwood. A moth flutters lazily near the flame. You pull a bundle labeled Criaturas Miserables, miserable creatures. The clerk must have had a sense of humor. Inside are cases both ridiculous and surprisingly tragic. One file tells of a rooster tried for laying an egg, which was seen as a demonic sign. Another recounts the trial of weevils who damaged a vineyard. The church held a ceremony begging them to leave voluntarily. French tidbit. In one bizarre case, the people of Autun, France, actually hired a lawyer to represent the weevils. He argued they were God's creatures and had a right to live. The judge agreed, to an extent. The weevils were offered a separate plot of land as a kind of insect retirement home. Historians still argue whether these cases were literal or metaphorical. Some claim they were sincere expressions of faith and justice. Others believe they were rituals meant to reinforce social norms, teaching the public that law touched everything, from kings to cows. You flip through more pages. A cow accused of trampling a priest. A cat tried for witchcraft. A swarm of locusts ordered by court decree to vacate a field. There's something oddly comforting about it all. These were people doing their best to understand a chaotic world, one full of disease, crop failures, famine, sudden death. If a donkey stared at you wrong in the middle of that, you might wonder if it was cursed too. And yet, as absurd as these trials were, there's a strange dignity in them. They speak to a time when humans still felt deeply connected to the animals they lived with, when a cow wasn't just a product, but a neighbor. When justice, no matter how theatrical, was expected to reach every corner of existence. You hear the bell tower chime twice. It's late now. The scrolls rustle softly as you return them to their cubby. And outside, the village snoozes like an old dog in a sunny patch of hay. You start walking again, past shuttered inns and mossy wells, letting the dark swallow your thoughts. And somewhere out there, in a damp field or under a thorny hedge, a goose sleeps soundly, utterly unaware that it was once the most infamous defendant in France. You don't blame it. The road veers slightly uphill now, winding past the thatched roofs and crooked timber beams of a village frozen in time. You move slowly, your feet quiet on the damp earth. There's a sliver of moon hanging low, casting gentle shadows that stretch like lazy cats across the stones. As the village fades behind you, your path leads toward a crumbling priory at the edge of a wooded glen. Inside, a sleepy monk leans over a candlelit desk, scratching notes into the margin of a parchment with all the urgency of someone who knows no one will ever read it. This is where the records of the Goose trial were stored, at least for a while. You approach the doorway and step into the warmth of the tiny scriptorium. Ink, Tallow and parchment fill the air, along with a faint trace of lavender, tucked between the pages perhaps to keep away the mice. You imagine yourself thumbing through a book bound in goat leather, its title long worn away. Mainstream fact, many monastic communities in medieval Europe doubled as legal record keepers. While we often think of monks as purely religious figures, they were also scribes, judges, administrators, even the occasional witnesses in local trials, animal or otherwise. And they were patient, unbelievably so. One monk might spend an entire day copying a single page, line by line, word by word, all in Latin. And if a goose had once honked in court, you can bet someone tried to record it in excruciating detail. Here's where it gets a little odd. Fringe tidbit, some scholars believe that in this very priory, a monk attempted to translate the testimony of the goose. Yes, you heard that right, by listening to its hunks and interpreting them through biblical allegory. Supposedly, he concluded the goose was possessed by the spirit of a former priest who had spoken ill of the bishopric. Historians still argue whether this was sincere theology, a local joke, or a quiet act of rebellion by a monk who really needed some entertainment. Either way, it made it into the margins. You turn another page. Someone has sketched a goose in the corner, wearing what looks suspiciously like a wig. You can almost hear the monk giggling into his robe sleeve. What's remarkable, though, is the care taken. These weren't throwaway notes or gossip. These records mattered. They were stored, copied, and passed along, not because people were foolish, but because they believed in order, even if that order required cross-examining a paltry defendant. The candle flickers low. The monk dips his quill, then pauses, as if sensing your presence from across the centuries. He leans back, sighs, and mutters something about parchment shortages and how geese should be judged by geese, not humans. You leave him to his musings and step back outside. The priory bells toll softly, like a lullaby for the stones. The wind carries the scent of rosemary and rain. You follow a path along the edge of the trees, thinking about all the hands that held that same book, those same records. And as you wander, your mind drifts, because in truth, these trials were not about justice in any modern sense. They were about ritual, symbol, the performance of community belief. In a world where everything was uncertain, harvests, health, weather, war, there was comfort in creating structure, even if it meant hauling a goose into court and asking it to explain itself. And that brings you to a quiet clearing where a stone bench waits beneath a yew tree. You sit down. The grass tickles your calves. The yew's branches hum softly in the breeze. And there, in the hush, you realize something. The people who tried the goose, they weren't trying to be silly. They were trying to find meaning in feathers, in fields, in fate. And in that search, well, maybe they weren't so different from you. The morning mist curls low as you follow a rutted cart path deeper into the countryside. Your breath puffs gently in the crisp air, each exhale caught briefly in the golden wash of sunrise peeking through the trees. The forest opens to a wide green pasture, and beyond that, a squat, time-worn manor house of half timber and gray stone, its roof sagging politely under centuries of rain. This is the domain of the señor, the local lord, whose fief includes, yes, responsibility for judicial matters, even when the defendant is feathered. The trial of the goose didn't happen in a royal court, nor even in the shadow of Notre Dame. It played out right here, in the patchwork of manorial jurisdictions that covered medieval France like an anxious quilt. Justice in this world was intensely local. Mainstream fact, in feudal France, nobles presided over manorial courts that handled everything from land disputes to accusations of theft, and yes, the occasional charge against an animal. These courts operated on a mix of custom, tradition, and the lord's good sense, though good sense varied widely by region and by wine vintage. You walk across the courtyard. It smells of hay and sheep oil and something faintly medicinal. A goose feather floats by, catching on the corner of a splintered wooden bench. You picture the trial, a makeshift courtroom assembled in the main hall. The Lord seated on a raised dais, surrounded by minor officials and possibly a dog that had no idea what was going on but was thrilled to be indoors. The goose stands near a barrel, flanked by 2 villagers roped into being guards. Someone probably offered it a crust of bread. It probably declined. Fringe tidbit: in some documented animal trials, defendants were provided with legal counsel. Human attorneys, learned men, argued in defense of pigs, cows, and even, once, a hive of bees. There's a somewhat contested account of one such advocate who later claimed to have been better paid by a goat than by most of his human clients. Historians still argue whether the practice of defending animals was driven by actual legal principle, religious conviction about the soul, or simply a desire to maintain the theater of law. And theater it was. Imagine the testimony. A farm wife nervously wringing her apron, swearing the goose pecked her nephew's ankle. A stable boy claiming it honked rudely during Sunday Mass. The local miller suggesting, in hushed tones, that the goose may in fact be the reincarnation of a long-dead rival. And the goose? It blinks, it waddles, it honks once, unexpectedly eloquent. You smile at the image. There's something deeply human in all of this. An oddball, slow-motion circus of formality and feeling, and everyone plays their part. Someone scribbles notes. Someone offers a snack. A child peeks around the doorframe. The village dog, confused, falls asleep under the bench. The Lord finally delivers his verdict, perhaps influenced by local politics, perhaps swayed by the goose's glinting eye, perhaps simply tired and craving a nap. The sentence might range from exile to death, or, in rare cases, absolution. Whatever it was, the ritual mattered. And so, it was done. You wander toward the old dovecote beside the barn, where moss climbs the stone walls and drowsy cooing fills the air. The birds blink at you with soft indifference, their heads bobbing gently. Somewhere nearby, a rooster begins crowing 3 hours too late. You sit on a low stone wall and gaze at the empty manor window. The court is long gone. The lords have faded into story. But the record remains. A goose, once charged with moral failing, once subject to judgment, once possibly offered a last meal of soaked oats and apples, left an imprint. Not because it was famous, but because it was noticed. And when you're quiet enough, you can almost hear it again. The shuffle of boots, the creak of wooden benches, the absurd dignity of a village trying its best to make sense of nonsense. That might be the most enduring thing of all. The wind picks up just slightly as you leave the manor behind, tugging at the laces of your sleeves and rustling the tall grasses that frame the road. Somewhere overhead, a kite circles lazily, its shadow brushing over a cow that doesn't seem to mind in the slightest. You're making your way back toward the village where the memory of the goose trial lingers like the smell of baking bread, faint but oddly persistent. Down the hill, you spot the low stone structure that passes for the local tavern. It's tilted ever so slightly to the left as if weary from centuries of overheard gossip. Inside, the scent of spiced wine and damp wool welcomes you. The wooden beams overhead are etched with initials, dates, and the occasional heart pierced by an arrow. Here, stories stick to the walls. Mainstream fact: in medieval Europe, taverns weren't just places to drink. They were vital hubs for news, storytelling, and informal justice. After official court proceedings, especially ones as memorable as a goose trial, villagers would gather to rehash every detail. Some tales would grow legs, others would sprout wings. You settle on a bench near the hearth, where embers still glow faintly. Someone has carved a crude goose into the tabletop.
You smile at it, tracing the lines with a fingertip. The trial, of course, didn't end at the verdict. No, in many ways, it had just begun, at least in the court of public opinion, which, as you know, has always been louder than any official ruling. Tales of the goose spread not just to the next village over, but to markets and monasteries farther afield. Fringe tidbit: in one preserved folk ballad from the 14th century, sung to the tune of a love song, naturally, the culprit goose is cast as a misunderstood noblewoman cursed to live as poultry until she proves her innocence. It ends with the wedding, of course, because why not? Historians still argue whether such songs were satirical jabs at the legal system or genuinely believed by villagers with more faith in music than in parchment. Back in the tavern, a few old men argue gently over whether the goose trial happened in 1312 or 1306. A widow at the bar insists it was her great something who guarded the goose during its imprisonment. No one checks records. No one needs to. The truth has long since blurred into comfort. Outside, the village green remains quiet. You walk past the little church, its bell tower leaning just slightly like it's listening in. There's a faint echo of children's laughter, long gone now, but preserved in the memory of moss and wood. As you wander through the sleepy streets, you spot small signs of the past trial's lasting impact. Someone has painted a goose above their door. Another home has a weather vane shaped like one, mid-waddle. A baker sells honking loaves every Sunday, goose-shaped bread with raisins for eyes and a cinnamon twist for the neck. You pause in front of a shrine nestled in a hollow tree where a wax figure of a goose, lopsided but proud, rests on a bed of rosemary. A copper coin glints at its feet. Offerings, remembrances, little nods to a moment when the ordinary bent ever so slightly toward the absurd. It's not just a village that remembers, it's a whole way of being, when stories mattered more than outcomes, and justice was equal parts performance and belief. You sit on the bench under the linden tree and look up at the sky, where clouds drift like slow ships across a sea of blue-gray. It's easy to scoff at the past, of course, but then you remember. Even today, people put cats on Instagram trials. Debates erupt over dogs eating homework. An octopus once predicted the outcome of the World Cup. The impulse to assign meaning to animals, to fold them into our human dramas, hasn't gone anywhere. Maybe we haven't changed as much as we think. Maybe, deep down, we still want the goose to tell us something. You close your eyes and listen to the breeze moving through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a real goose honks, sounding not at all guilty and not at all interested in legal precedent. Good for her. Your boots crunch softly over the damp village path as you leave behind the linden tree and the faint echo of tavern laughter. Ahead, the road curves through fields painted in gold and green, where crops sway and wildflowers lean in like curious eavesdroppers. The sun has dipped low, stretching shadows that seem to walk with you. You follow the road, not out of duty, but curiosity, still chasing the threads of a trial that refuses to settle into silence. Not far from here, in a tucked-away cloister, lives Brother Emmerich, scribe, herbalist, and reluctant chronicler of all things ridiculous. He's hunched like a question mark and smells faintly of thyme. You find him in his garden, bent over a patch of marjoram, muttering Latin and scolding a snail. When he sees you, he doesn't greet you, just squints and says, "You hear about the goose, aren't you?" Of course you are. Mainstream fact. Medieval monasteries and cloisters often served as the de facto record keepers of local events, both sacred and mundane. It wasn't unusual for monks to jot down everything from crop cycles to celestial events, and occasionally the errant animal trial. Brother Emmerich, reluctant though he is, happens to be one of those monks. He leads you into a stone cell lined with scrolls and ink pots. The parchment crackles as he unrolls a document, dated, according to a shaky hand, 1310 something or other. It's a curious mix of Latin legalese and what can only be described as frustrated doodles of poetry. There, he says, pointing to the margin, she laid an egg during sentencing. You blank. The goose? He nods, satisfied. Right there in the court, between the charges and the bishop's closing remarks, made quite the mess. Fringe tidbit. In some rural records, often dismissed as apocryphal, a goose accused of theft was said to have laid a golden egg in court. Not metaphorically, a literal golden egg. Was it alchemy, trickery, some monk with a sense of humor? Historians still argue whether this was meant symbolically or if it was just a prank that snowballed into folklore. You lean closer to the parchment. There's a faint stain next to the doodle. Eggshell residue perhaps, or old ink, or the remains of a snack eaten far too close to history. Why did they write it all down, you ask him, half whispering, as if afraid to wake the sleeping dust around you. Because people forget, he replies, shrugging, and because they don't. Depends on the year. That's the thing, isn't it? The goose was sentenced. Maybe it was pardoned. Maybe it wasn't. The records trail off, or contradict, or overlap. And through the gaps, a dozen versions bloom, each one with a little more flair than the last. You thank Brother Emmerich and step back into the fading daylight, the parchment's odd little details still fluttering in your mind. Outside the cloister, the world feels heavier in its quiet, or maybe just softer. You follow a narrow trail that winds past a stream. The water babbles like a drunk poet, not caring who listens. A family of ducks floats past, cousins perhaps of the infamous defendant. You nod to them respectfully. They quack non-committally in return. By the edge of the stream, you come upon a mossy bench carved with another familiar shape, a goose, this time with a blindfold on, holding tiny scales in its beak. It's ridiculous, and kinda beautiful, because even centuries later, the imagery remains, half serious, half parody, but always present. The way people turned a moment of absurdity into shared memory, into story, into bedtime lore, really. Historians still argue whether the trial of the goose was a morality tale disguised as jurisprudence or jurisprudence disguised as farce. Some claim it was an exercise in law's universality, that all beings, no matter how feathered, must answer to order. Others think it was satire, plain and simple, a jab at overreaching authority wrapped in bird fluff. You rest on the bench, the stone cool beneath you, and wonder which version feels more true. Above, the moon begins to yawn awake, pale and sleepy. The shadows deepen, but the path ahead is still faintly visible, still calling. You rise, brushing moss from your coat, and continue forward, because the story hasn't quite let go of you yet. The trail dips downward now, tracing the edge of an old forest where the trees grow close together like gossiping villagers, bending slightly, leaning in, murmuring through the rustle of their leaves. You tread carefully. The light has thickened into amber. The path is less clear. But then again, so is history. As you walk, the sound of clucking rises from somewhere just beyond the thicket, unnervingly rhythmic. You push through the underbrush and stumble into a forgotten clearing. No buildings, no signposts, just a crude wooden post at the center, crowned with a weathered carving of a goose in mid-hunk. Is this a memorial? You're not sure. But as you step closer, you spot faint scratchings on the base of the post. They're too eroded to read, but you recognize symbols from ecclesiastical seals, perhaps an abandoned shrine, or the remains of a satirical pilgrimage site. Some locals, it seems, had a long memory for foulish injustice. Mainstream fact: in parts of medieval Europe, animal trials were sometimes commemorated through local folklore, minor relics, or even processions, especially if the event had drawn large crowds or been associated with divine signs. What began as judicial spectacle often rippled into community tradition. And here's the part that gets weirder. You sit by the post, brushing aside moss, and from your satchel you pull the parchment copy you took from Brother Emmerich. You hold it against the wood, and wouldn't you know, it matches. The carving on the top resembles the same illustration scrawled next to the egg event during sentencing. A goose, beak open, wings raised like a defendant pleading its case. Coincidence? Maybe. But you're beginning to realize this trial wasn't forgotten. Not entirely. In fact, you're not the first to go looking. Fringe tidbit. A 17th century traveler's diary, preserved in bits across Flemish archives, mentions a silent priest who wandered from village to village with a single goose. He would enter a tavern, let the bird honk once, then preach about humility and judgment. No name, no church affiliation. He simply called himself the Advocate. Was he inspired by the 1300s trial? A descendant of the original judge? Or someone who just really liked geese? Historians still argue whether this advocate ever existed, or whether he was simply an invention by later storytellers trying to stitch meaning onto scattered legend. Some even suspect the story is a parody of Franciscan preachers who often traveled with animals for companionship or stage props. You lean back on your elbows, letting the air settle. There's something oddly serene about a goose-shaped monument weathering away in the middle of nowhere. It's like stumbling onto a joke that nature is still telling. Just then, you hear movement, soft feet on leaf litter. You freeze. From between two oaks, a girl appears, maybe 12, barefoot, clutching a bundle of herbs. She stares at you, then at the goose carving. "Are you looking for the cursed one?" she asks plainly. "The goose?" She nods solemnly. "She comes here sometimes. I leave bread. She never eats it." You blink. "Is she real?" you ask. The girl shrugs. "Depends who's asking." Then she turns and vanishes as quickly as she appeared, leaving behind only a faint trail of crushed mint. Okay then. You stay seated for a while, waiting to see if the cursed goose shows up. She doesn't. Or maybe she does, in some way, just not the kind you can photograph. Eventually, you rise and continue your walk. The forest closes in a little more now. The sun's officially gone, but the stars are out, like breadcrumbs laid by a very optimistic bird. The trail shifts. Instead of heading forward, it curves sharply east. You follow it, boots crunching in time with your thoughts. And this is where it hits you. The trial wasn't about a goose. Not really. It was about theater, about order, about giving people something to point at and say, "See, that's wrong. Even the animals aren't safe." It was control in the form of absurdity, or maybe absurdity in the shape of control. And still, somehow, people found meaning in it, or humor, or beauty. They carved it into wood. They preached it in taverns. They passed it down through giggles and lullabies. That's the legacy of the goose, not the verdict, the echo. The trail becomes narrower now, like it's second-guessing itself. You duck beneath low-hanging branches and hop over stubborn roots that jut from the soil like crooked old fingers. The air feels cooler here, infused with the quiet of deep woods. Everything muffles. Even your own footsteps feel distant. You're heading toward what remains of the courthouse, or at least where records claim it once stood. According to Brother Emmerich's Marginalia and a handful of spotty village accounts, the original courthouse of Savigny-le-Roi was dismantled sometime in the late 1400s, likely after it was deemed structurally unsound and spiritually compromised by certain clergy. A new one was built uphill. The old site was left to vines and superstition. Mainstream fact: in medieval Europe, public buildings, including town halls and courthouses, were often repurposed or dismantled entirely when their reputation soured. A courthouse that played host to scandalous events might be considered cursed or tainted by divine disfavor. You break into a small clearing, and there it is. Barely anything left. Just a ring of mossy stones forming what might once have been a foundation, half covered by bramble and wild thyme. But something about the space holds its shape. You can almost see the bench, the seats for the jury, the central platform where witnesses stood. And the box. Yes, the animal dock. Right there, near the gnarled yew. You can picture the goose in it, puffed up and indignant. Fringe tidbit: some reconstructed court maps from animal trials include a specially designated witness perch for animals. It's unclear whether this was symbolic or if animals were actually placed on raised platforms to make them more visible to the crowd. Either way, it's hilarious. You walk the perimeter, then pause near what would have been the judge's chair. A hollow in the stone catches your eye, smooth as if worn by years of use. You sit. Let the silence settle around you. Birdsong, wind, the creak of the yew. And then, imagine. You're the judge now. The defendant? A goose, majestic, slightly cross-eyed, rumored to have laid an egg on the altar. The prosecution stands tall, cloaked in velvet and righteousness. They cite the books, they quote the saints, they look deeply concerned. The defense is late, always late, arrives with ink stains on his cuffs and breadcrumbs in his beard. And then there's the jury. 7 villagers, 1 friar, and a drunk pig herder who thought he was showing up for free bread. The goose honks once, and the trial begins. Historians still argue whether animal trials were taken seriously by everyone in the room. Some contend that participants earnestly believed in the spiritual culpability of animals, especially those seen as familiar spirits or signs from God. Others argue these trials were tongue-in-cheek, a kind of public ritual meant to reaffirm community values under the guise of solemnity. But sitting here now, in this imaginary courtroom, you realize it didn't really matter what the people believed. What mattered was the performance. The trial was a show. For the crowd, for the nobles, maybe even for the sky. And, like all good shows, it had stakes. Would the goose be condemned? Pardoned? Would a miracle interrupt the verdict? Spoiler, no miracle came. Just a sentence. Death. But you already knew that. You lie back in the grass now, head resting near what might have been the scribe's post. A snail inches along a nearby stone, trailing slime like ink. It's peaceful here, in the ghost of a courthouse. And absurd. You can almost hear someone whisper, "Order in the coop." Then, faintly behind you, wings. You sit up fast, nothing. Just leaves moving in a breeze that wasn't there before. You chuckle softly to yourself. It's probably just your imagination. Or maybe this place has a way of playing tricks. Either way, it's working. The forest has taken the courthouse back. But you wonder, if you tried hard enough, could you hear echoes? Just a little? The squawk of defiance? The shuffle of solemn boots? The amused sigh of a clerk who's seen worse? You try. You really do. And, for a moment, you swear you catch a faint honk on the wind. Or maybe it's just your stomach. You did skip dinner. Either way, the trial's over. The sentence passed. But the story? That's still unfolding. You rise from the crumbled courtroom, brushing bits of moss from your clothes, and continue along the trail. The trees thin slightly, allowing spears of golden twilight to pierce the canopy. Your feet crunch softly over leaves that have no memory of geese or trials, just seasons, coming and going like quiet waves. Now, you're heading toward the execution site. Yes, that's right, they executed the goose. According to what little remains in the village register, most of it barely legible, the judgment was swift and its punishment equally dramatic. The goose, convicted of profanation of sacred space and possibly consorting with unholy spirits, was sentenced to death by hanging. And no, you didn't mishear that. Hanging. Mainstream fact. Executions of animals in medieval Europe often mirrored those of humans. Hogs were hanged, cows burned, and dogs occasionally beheaded. The idea was to maintain spiritual symmetry. If the sin was human-like, the punishment should be too. You approach a low hill now, overgrown with ferns and stinging nettle. At its crown stands a single wooden post, darkened by weather and centuries of lore. It's not the original, of course. Local historical societies love a good replica, but it marks the spot. This is where it happened. You pause and try to picture the scene.
The goose, tethered and flapping. The executioner, who probably drew the short straw that morning. And the crowd, dozens of villagers with baskets of onions, children hoisted on shoulders, whispers flitting like moths. Will it cry out? Will it explode? Is it even guilty? Fringe tidbit. In several recorded cases of animal executions, executioners actually wore masks, not to protect their identities, but as symbolic gestures that separated them from the spiritual weight of what they were doing. Some masks were crudely drawn faces, others resembled saints or mythical beasts. You imagine the man in the mask stepping forward, rope in hand. The goose, resigned, dignified even. And the crowd, not cheering, but watching. Like they were waiting for some final sign, a lightning bolt, a bleeding feather, anything to prove this wasn't as ridiculous as it looked. But nothing happened. The goose was hanged. The rope tightened. The wings stopped flapping. And then it was over. Historians still argue whether this event had any long-term spiritual effect on the village. Some say it cleansed the area, ushering in a brief era of agricultural bounty and low infant mortality. Others dismiss that as mere coincidence, noting that a dry summer followed and most of the region's cabbage crop turned bitter. You sit in the grass and lean against the post. It's warm from the sun, odd considering the weight it once bore. There's something strangely moving about it all, this tiny tragedy, this absurd seriousness. You start thinking about justice, about how people need it to make sense, even when it doesn't. Maybe, especially when it doesn't. Maybe that's why they hanged a goose, not because they thought it would fix anything, but because they didn't know what else to do. Someone had to be punished, and it sure wasn't going to be the priest who left the door open. The wind picks up, gently swaying the tall grass. A butterfly flits past, unconcerned by ancient crimes. You close your eyes and feel the stillness around you. And just like that, you're back at the hanging. But this time, something's different. There's a pause right before the executioner pulls the rope. He hesitates, looks at the crowd, looks at the goose. You can almost hear him thinking, "What are we doing?" He sighs. The crowd waits. And then, in a voice just above a whisper, the masked man says, "Does anyone want to pardon the goose?" And for a second, it's silent. Then a child steps forward, small, barefoot, eyes wide with that unnerving clarity children sometimes have. She points at the goose and says, "It's just hungry." A few villagers nod. Someone drops an onion. And then, like fog lifting, the crowd disperses. You blink and the vision fades. You're alone again. The post stands tall, casting a long shadow behind you. Was that real? No, probably not. But it should have been. You pick up a fallen feather near the base of the post. It's white, smooth, a little dirty. You twirl it between your fingers, then tuck it into your pocket. A souvenir from the strangest courtroom you've never actually visited. As you descend the hill, you realize something. The goose's execution may have ended its life, but it birthed a myth, a story, one told quietly and rarely, but always with the same odd reverence. Because deep down, everyone knew this wasn't about the goose. It was about the people, their fear, their rituals, their need to make nonsense feel sacred. And isn't that the most human thing of all? You reach the bottom of the hill, and behind you, the replica post leans just slightly in the breeze. You don't look back, but you swear, just swear, you hear one last honk. Soft, triumphant, maybe even a little smug. The path bends as you leave the execution site behind, threading through elder trees and drowsy groves of honeysuckle. The air feels softer now, as if even the forest is a little tired from all that courtroom drama. But you're not done. Not yet. Because what happens after a goose is hanged? Well, you bury it. Probably. Or maybe you don't. Historians still argue whether ceremonial burials were ever given to animal criminals or whether their bodies were simply discarded, burned, buried anonymously, or, as one scholar suggests, left for the crows, a gesture of poetic irony. There's no definitive record for this goose's afterlife, but the next stretch of road carries you to where they think the burial ground might be. It's just a clearing now. No headstones, no plaques. Just a sagging patch of wildflowers, a few lopsided stones, and the faint scent of chamomile in the wind. You sit down near what looks like a mound. Could be a grave, could just be a spot where the earth is remembering something. And that's when you wonder, what if it was buried like a human? Mainstream fact. Some medieval animal trials did result in ceremonial treatment post-execution. A pig in 1386, convicted of child murder, was dressed in human clothes for trial and reportedly received a formal burial after her hanging. There's even documentation that some communities held short services for the condemned animal, more out of custom than compassion. So, if they gave that pig a shroud and a sermon, maybe this goose got something too. You imagine the villagers gathered again, only this time quieter. Not righteous, not outraged, just tired. They lower the goose into a shallow pit lined with pine needles and folded sackcloth. A boy tosses in a crust of bread. An old woman mutters something about the Holy Spirit and birds. And then, as the dirt is scattered back into the hole, someone starts humming. You can't place the tune, but it sounds vaguely like a lullaby. Fringe tidbit. There's a recorded French folk song from the 14th century believed to be inspired by animal trials, known loosely as Le Chant de l'Oie Jugée, the song of the judged goose. Only one fragment of the lyric survives, and it translates roughly to, "Feathers fall where no sin grows, under beak and bell the silence knows." You hum it softly. It suits the moment. And you think about the absurd weight this village carried, the need to control chaos, to put a name and face to every fear, even if that face had a beak and waddled. You lie back in the grass and gaze up at the sky. Clouds drift lazily overhead, shaped like nothing in particular. You wonder what they were really punishing. Was it the goose, or was it something else? Maybe the bird just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. A scapegoat, if you will. Sorry, that one slipped out. But seriously, was it about heretics? About fear of change? About suppressing the wild, untamed things that people didn't understand? Historians love to speculate on that. Some suggest that these trials were less about justice and more about asserting power, about reminding people that the church and state could punish anything, even nature itself. Others argue the trials offered a strange kind of comfort, a ritual that brought structure to the chaos of plagues, crop failures, and general medieval anxiety. And maybe, for a moment, that comfort worked. You stretch out, fingers brushing over tiny white flowers you don't recognize. They smell faintly of apples. A beetle crawls across your shoe and disappears into the grass. Time slows. You think again about the goose. Not the trial, not the hanging, not even the burial. Just the bird. What did it think of all this? Did it understand? Probably not. Did it feel fear? Maybe. Or maybe it just wanted to go home, back to its pond, its worms, its sky. You like that idea, that even at the height of absurdity, the goose remains simple, innocent, untouched by law, by theology, by the long speeches of robe-wearing men. Just a bird. Wings, eyes, breath. You roll over onto your side, grass tickling your neck, and stare at the spot you think might be the grave. There's no marker, but that doesn't matter, because the goose is remembered, not in stone, but in story. And stories, as you've probably realized by now, are the closest thing to immortality that most of us get. You sit up, brushing petals from your sleeve. The air shifts slightly, cooler now. Dusk is curling in from the edges of the sky like smoke. You give the clearing one last look, then stand, stretch, exhale, and begin walking again. The path curves into shadow, and the story continues. Your footsteps grow softer as you move further from the burial site, the earth beneath you now padded with moss and centuries of forgotten leaves. The path narrows, winding through what feels like a natural cathedral of ash trees and ivy-wrapped trunks. Birdsong is fading, replaced by the occasional creak of wood, like the forest itself is settling down for the night. You'd think the story would be winding down too, but no, because the ripples of one goose's trial didn't stop with her last breath. They fluttered outward through law books, village gossip, theological debates, and even the early cracks in medieval belief systems. You're walking into the aftermath now, not just of the trial, but of what it meant. Mainstream fact? Believe it or not, some legal scholars actually took these animal trials quite seriously. In the 15th century, a respected French jurist named Bartholomew Chassenet wrote detailed legal defenses for animals on trial, including a famous case where he defended a group of rats accused of destroying crops. He argued that the rats had a right to a fair trial and even petitioned for their safety on the grounds that they couldn't appear in court due to the dangers posed by village cats. Wild, right? You pause beneath a crooked branch. Imagine being a lawyer who specializes in representing pigs and rats. Now imagine being really good at it. Historians still argue whether these animal attorneys genuinely believed in animal rights, or if it was all performance art for the courtroom, a medieval version of satire wearing a judge's wig. Some think people like Chassenet were actually challenging the absurdity of the system from within, using logic to highlight its contradictions. Others argue they were just very good at playing along. And then there were the copycats. After the Goose, similar trials popped up more frequently across rural France and the Holy Roman Empire. Donkeys, cows, even beetles were charged with offenses ranging from theft to sacrilege. In one bizarre case, a swarm of weevils was excommunicated from a vineyard for damaging grapevines. You picture a robed priest standing under the sun, shaking his fist at invisible insects, shouting Latin into the air like he's cursing ghosts. French tidbit. Some historians believe that these public excommunications of animals were secretly used to bless the land while pretending to curse it, an odd backdoor way to get the church's attention on agricultural problems without admitting to failures in stewardship. You reach a fork in the trail. One direction leads downhill toward water. The other snakes uphill, shaded in shadows. You choose the darker path, because why not? As you walk, a thought rises, quiet and uninvited. What's the line between belief and theater? The villagers surely believed in the divine power of judgment. They believed the trial meant something, that punishing a goose could cleanse a wrong, restore a balance. But was it justice or ritual? Maybe both. You think about that night at the village inn after the execution, mugs clinking, stories retold with dramatic flair. The same tale already growing horns and feathers, each version stranger than the last. You picture a child asking, "But what if it wasn't the goose?" and being shushed. Because the point wasn't truth. The point was having a point, a narrative, a symbol. Humans crave symbols. You've noticed that. We dress up our fear in costumes and cages and trials because it's easier to put a goose on a stand than to admit we don't know why bad things happen. The forest begins to thin, revealing a stone wall. Low and crumbling, it circles a clearing where something used to stand. You step over it. It's a ruin, just a few slabs of sun-bleached stone and a collapsed arch, overgrown with lichen. A chapel once stood here. Tiny, humble, a village's only house of God. No pews left, just moss and memory. You sit on what might have been the altar and imagine the villagers returning here after the trial, seeking comfort, or maybe forgiveness. Did anyone confess they thought the trial was wrong, that the goose wasn't guilty?
Or did they all pretend it made sense because pretending is easier when the whole town agrees to do it together? You hear wind pass through the empty space where windows once lived. It whistles like breath through a reed flute. And you wonder, what if the real reason the trial stuck in memory wasn't because of its absurdity, but because it revealed something unspoken, like how quickly people will trade reason for certainty, how much we crave order even if we have to invent it, or maybe just how lonely it is to be the only one who says, "This doesn't feel right." You rest your back against a stone and close your eyes. The cool rock presses into your spine. For a moment, you feel like part of the ruin, ancient, unnoticed, surrounded by silence that doesn't ask anything from you.
You let yourself imagine the goose one last time. Not on trial, not in a noose, but just gliding across a quiet pond. Its wings open, its eyes soft, free. A creature that didn't understand guilt or sin or the crushing machinery of human institutions. Just wind, water, sky. Simple. Maybe even holy. You stay there a little longer, listening to the forest breathe. It doesn't judge. It doesn't forget either. But it forgives in its own way. Always has. You rise slowly from the stone, brushing away a few stray pine needles that have gathered in your lap, like time itself has tried to reclaim you. The night deepens. The air smells of old bark and damp earth, and every sound, the rustle of a branch, the shuffle of your feet, feels softened, as if cushioned by centuries. And now, as your path curves downward again, you return not to the village, but to the records. The ink-stained corners of medieval bureaucracy, where the echoes of the Goose's trial were inked, archived, and somehow preserved. Mainstream fact. You might be surprised to know that records of animal trials, including this Goose case, were often meticulously kept. Medieval notaries recorded testimonies, verdicts, and sentences just as they would for human cases. These weren't treated as jokes. They were fully documented legal affairs, filed away with all the solemn gravity of tax disputes or land grants. You step through a patch of soft ferns, the fronds brushing against your knees like ghost hands. Ahead, you spot a crooked wooden structure barely standing, an old scribe's hut, perhaps. Of course, it's metaphorical now. You're not actually walking through ancient records. But your mind is. You push the door open in your imagination, and there they are. Parchment scrolls, stacked high. Each one etched with the looping hand of a cleric, detailing the offense of one unnamed goose accused of heretical pecking and violent unrest. Quirky tidbit. In some medieval legal traditions, animals were actually appointed guardians, just like orphaned children. These human proxies were tasked with protecting the creature's legal interests and had to argue in court why, for example, a pig that ate a child shouldn't be held fully responsible because it lacked intent. You picture a robed official seriously discussing swine morality with other grown men nodding solemnly. Historians still argue whether the notaries believed any of this was real law or if it was closer to liturgy, part of the church's broader performance of social control. Some scholars suggest these trials weren't really about justice at all, but a way to reinforce church power in rural areas where folk beliefs still thrived. And here's the twist. These documents weren't lost. They were preserved. You imagine dusty volumes titled Proceedings of the Diocesan Court, 1386, sitting on shelves in quiet European archives, perhaps forgotten for centuries, until, one day, a modern researcher leafs through them and freezes. Wait, did this say Goose? Yes, Goose, on trial, executed. You kneel beside a half-collapsed bench, maybe the scribe's own seat. The wood is worn smooth by time and elbows. You imagine him, just a man doing his job, dipping his quill in ink, writing with all the seriousness of a monk transcribing scripture. And yet, in between the solemn phrases, like aforementioned creature did partake in the tumult, you wonder if he ever smirked, if he ever paused, looked around and thought, what are we doing? But he didn't stop, because his job was to write, not to ask. That's the thing about systems. They don't need belief to function, just participation. And people, well, we're pretty good at participating, especially when the alternative is standing out. You move deeper into this imaginary archive, brushing dust from another scroll. This one contains appeals from villagers who disagreed with the verdict. Yes, those existed. A small group claimed the goose was innocent, that she had been provoked or misunderstood. They were ignored. Because, once the narrative has momentum, dissent feels like a pebble tossed at a landslide. Still, it mattered that someone tried. You pause by a window where the moonlight slants in sharply. It falls across the ghostly shelves like a spotlight on forgotten memory. And you realize something. The records lasted not because people believed in the trial, but because they believed in recording, in documentation, in leaving a trace. That's the irony. The trial's absurdity might have vanished into oral lore, but it was the very seriousness with which it was documented that cemented its place in history. Paper doesn't care if your story makes sense. It only asks that you write it down. And someone did. Multiple someones. Over and over. You stand again and take a slow breath, the kind that feels like pulling air from a deep well. The hut begins to fade in your mind, the scrolls curling inward like sleeping leaves. You step outside. The forest has changed. It's quieter now, deeper somehow, like you're nearing the place where stories end, where even memory softens into quiet hums. Above you, a single owl calls out, low and deliberate. It sounds, oddly, like a...
Above you, a single owl calls out, low and deliberate. It sounds, oddly, like a gavel falling. And just like that, the chapter of the scribes closes. But not the story. Because a few more paths remain, twisting toward the strange legacy this trial would leave in the modern mind, and the philosophers who'd later look back and ask, wait, why did we put a goose on trial? And why does it still feel familiar? The owl's cry echoes behind you, and you walk on, deeper into the story, deeper into a time that, despite how distant it may seem, still curls itself quietly around the present. You're moving now through a corridor of tall ash trees. Their trunks are pale and smooth, like old ivory, and their leaves shiver in a breeze you don't quite feel. The air is cooler here, not colder, just more precise, as though history itself has sharpened around you. And somewhere, tucked between root and shadow, you begin to sense something strange. The trial didn't stay in the past. Mainstream fact, centuries after these trials were considered ridiculous and archaic, the idea of non-human defendants kept reappearing, just in different clothes. In 19th century America, companies were sometimes prosecuted as though they were people. And now, in the 21st century, corporations have legal personhood. Not in some goofy animal on the stand kind of way, but very real, very powerful. You take a slow breath. What's the difference, really, between a goose who can stand trial and a company that can own property, sue, or be sued? You smile a little. Maybe the goose was just ahead of her time. Quirky tidbit. In 2004, a city in Argentina granted an orangutan named Sandra limited legal rights. She wasn't charged with the crime, she was freed from captivity. But the language used, it echoed medieval debates about non-human moral agency. Courts again, trying to decide, can something that isn't human still have a place in our laws? Historians still argue whether these modern echoes are true parallels or just rhetorical flourishes. Are we looping back toward old habits or just dressing new ones in antique robes? Some scholars suggest it's less about logic, more about narrative. Humans don't need airtight reasoning, we need stories we can live inside. And what's a courtroom if not the world's most serious theater? You continue walking, your steps hushed beneath fallen leaves. The woods are no longer just medieval France.
They're not even just symbolic anymore. They've become timeless. Because the Goose trial wasn't just about geese. It was about us. About how humans project meaning, guilt, responsibility onto anything we can name. If we give it a title, we believe it can be judged. And if it can be judged, well, that's the first step to power, isn't it? You pause beside a small brook, its waters barely moving. It gurgles faintly, like it's muttering secrets to itself. You kneel down and peer into it. The surface shimmers, and for a moment, it's not water at all, but glass. And in that glass, you see a courtroom. Not stone, not candlelit, but modern. Fluorescent lights, polished wood, microphones. And sitting in the defendant's chair is a goose. Not the same goose from the village square, of course. This one's symbolic. She wears a tie. She represents your favorite fast food chain, or your insurance company, or your phone provider. She's done something wrong, at least you feel like she has, but somehow, no matter how the trial goes, she'll still be there tomorrow, still honking softly in your wallet. You blink, and the image dissolves. The brook is just a brook. The water trickles on, careless and unjudged. You rise and walk again. And now, through the trees, you glimpse strange lights. Not fire, not torch, something softer, like bioluminescence. A clearing opens, filled with statues. Stone figures of animals, all mid-pose. Some fierce, some playful, some regal, some afraid. And each one bears a plaque. The Cow of Dijon, 1434. The Rat of Autun, 1510. The Rooster of Basel, 1474. Yes, that one's real. A rooster was once tried for laying an egg. The court suspected witchcraft. Male chickens, you see, don't lay eggs, so either this was a miracle or something darker. It was probably just a hen with particularly unfortunate features, but at the time, witchcraft seemed more narratively satisfying. That's the thing. Medieval trials weren't about biology. They were about control. If you could name the threat, you could contain it. And if you could put it on trial, well, then even the devil had to play by your rules. You wander among the statues, touching each one lightly. And you begin to notice something odd. Every face is vaguely human. The eyes, the mouth. As if the sculptor wasn't sure where animal ended and person began. Or maybe they knew exactly what they were doing. Because deep down, maybe we've always known. The goose was never just a goose. She was a mirror, held up to us. And what did we see? A creature without reason, yet punished as if she had it. A being without power, yet blamed for disrupting power's order. Sound familiar? You move to the center of the clearing. The statues surround you now, their stone gazes heavy. And in the middle, a small pedestal, empty, waiting. You sit down on it, not as judge, not as jury, just as witness. You close your eyes and hear nothing but quiet, because now you understand. The legacy of the Goose trial isn't about whether animals can be evil. It's about how far humans will go to keep the illusion of control intact. Even if it means dressing chaos in feathers. Even if it means pretending that noise was always a voice. Even if it means putting a bird in the dock and calling it justice. The forest dims. Your breath slows. You feel the weight of the centuries settle gently on your shoulders. And still, somewhere in the archives of law, the ink remains. The scrolls don't fade. They only wait. You rise from the quiet pedestal, feeling the weight of those carved eyes following you, those silent witnesses to centuries of human stories tangled in feathers and fur. The forest around you deepens into twilight, the shadows long and slow, stretching like the stories themselves, pulling you closer to the final threads. You walk forward, almost instinctively, as if the path knows the next step better than you do. You find yourself approaching a small village, one that feels less medieval and more familiar. The houses are rough but warm, with smoke curling from chimneys, the smell of wood smoke mingling with something earthy and sweet. Somewhere a dog barks softly, and a child's laughter drifts on the breeze. In this village, the trial of the goose wasn't just a legal curiosity. It was a living memory, told and retold over firesides and market stalls. People here still whisper the story with a mix of disbelief and a knowing smile, as if the absurdity of it all is the very point. Mainstream fact: the medieval animal trials, including the famous Goose trial, took place mostly between the 13th and 17th centuries, primarily in France and parts of Europe, reflecting a legal system where the line between human and animal responsibility blurred in ways modern law simply doesn't allow. You settle onto a worn wooden bench outside a small tavern, the faint murmur of voices spilling out from inside. The warmth seeps into your bones. This place, with its crooked streets and uneven stones, seems to cradle the past gently. Quirky tidbit: in one such village, there was once a pig put on trial for supposedly killing a child. The pig was dressed in tiny clothes and assigned a lawyer, an official who pleaded for mercy on the pig's behalf. Spoiler alert, the pig was executed. The scene sounds like something from a dark comedy, but at the time, it was serious business. Historians still argue whether these trials reflected genuine belief in animal culpability or were more symbolic gestures to assert human authority and social order. Some suggest that the spectacle was as much about community cohesion as about justice, setting boundaries between what was human and what was other, order and chaos. You close your eyes, feeling the village's heartbeat sync with yours. The story isn't just about a bird or a pig or a rat. It's about how humans tried to make sense of a wild, unpredictable world. It's about the rituals we invent to tame our fears. You imagine the courtroom, rough-hewn and smoky, where villagers gathered not just to witness justice, but to reaffirm their place in the universe. The goose, perhaps oblivious to her role, became a symbol, an unlikely actor on a stage where humans wrestled with questions of guilt, innocence, and power. You open your eyes, catching a glimpse of a wooden sign swinging gently in the breeze. Its paint faded, but still readable. La Cour des Animaux, the Court of Animals. A place where the absurd and the earnest met, where feathers could carry the weight of the law. You take a deep breath, feeling the story settling around you like a soft blanket. Because sometimes history isn't about grand battles or famous kings. Sometimes it's about the little stories, the weird, the forgotten, the bizarre, that show us how deeply human we really are. You lean back against the bench, eyes growing heavy as the evening folds into night. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, you hear the faintest honk. The village fades behind your closed eyelids, replaced by the gentle hush of night settling over the countryside. You feel the rhythm of centuries pulsing softly beneath you, as if the earth itself remembers the curious trial of that one peculiar goose. You trace the story's final threads, winding slowly back through the dim corridors of memory, letting the calm wash over you like a cool evening breeze. You imagine yourself once more in the courtroom, the gathered townsfolk nodding and whispering, the clack of wooden benches, the murmur of rustling robes. The judge's gavel, a simple wooden block, echoes faintly, less a sound of finality, more a gentle punctuation in a long conversation about law, order, and the strange ways humans try to impose their will on the world around them. Mainstream fact: medieval courts regularly tried animals, ranging from insects to mammals, usually for property damage or harm to humans, reflecting a complex mixture of superstition, legal theory, and social control. You picture the goose, feathers ruffled and preening, oddly serene amid the chaos of human concerns. Perhaps she felt none of the weight we ascribed, but she became a focal point for something greater, a way for people to grapple with guilt, blame, and the unpredictable wildness in their lives. Quirky tidbit. In some animal trials, convicted creatures were given a stay of execution if they confessed or showed remorse, sometimes through bizarre symbolic gestures like kneeling or bowing, which were interpreted with surprising seriousness. Historians still debate whether these rituals were sincere attempts at justice or more performative ceremonies designed to reinforce the power structures of medieval society. Some scholars suggest these trials functioned like communal storytelling, blending humor, fear, and order to keep the social fabric intact. You feel the story slowing now, the details softening like the fading light. The trial of the goose isn't a punchline or a footnote. It's a quiet mirror reflecting our own human need for meaning, our attempts to make sense of chaos, and the gentle absurdities we embrace along the way. The night deepens. You drift with the stories that refuse to be forgotten, cradled by the gentle hum of the world turning, of history folding softly into dreams. You let out a slow breath, a smile tugging at the corners of your mouth as the tale settles into the quiet corners of your mind. And with that, you rest. Sweet dreams.